Part 1. The Arrival. The mockery began not with words, but with silence. It was a specific kind of quiet, the sort that falls over a room when something doesn't belong. Alara Vance was that something. The C-130's ramp lowered with a hydraulic groan, blasting the cabin with the thin, bitingly cold air of forward operating base Black Ridge. The other passengers, a dozen fresh-faced Army privates, clutched their rifles and shuffled into the alpine sunlight, their boots clomping on the steel. Alara followed, a single duffel bag slung over her shoulder, her only other luggage a Pelican case that held a laptop and sensitive documents. She wore simple cargo pants and a plain gray jacket, her face impassive, her gaze sweeping the perimeter before she'd even taken a full step onto the gravel tarmac. They mocked her at the range later that week, their whispers just loud enough to carry on the ceaseless wind. They saw a civilian analyst, a pencil pusher sent from some sterile office in Virginia to justify a budget. But they didn't see the way she watched the wind or the stillness in her hands. That was until a visiting Navy SEAL, frustrated with the failing marksman, broke protocol and handed her his multi-$1,000 sniper rifle. He didn't know who she was, but in the space between one heartbeat and the next, he and everyone else on that mountain was about to find out. The base was an ugly, functional scar carved into the side of a mountain 10,000 feet above sea level. It was a place designed to mimic the harshest conditions on Earth, a training ground where the air was a thief of breath and the wind was a constant, malevolent entity. HESCO barriers and concertina wire formed a crude perimeter against a backdrop of jagged, snow-dusted peaks. The buildings were little more than glorified shipping containers, painted a dull, desert tan. Alara was assigned to one of these containers, a small office space she was to share with a logistics sergeant who looked at her with undisguised pity. "Ma'am, command says you get this desk. Let me know if you need, paper clips or anything." "Thank you, Sergeant," she said, her voice even and low. It held no hint of complaint. She placed her bag on the floor and her Pelican case on the desk with a quiet click. The sergeant lingered, expecting a question, a complaint about the dust, the flickering fluorescent light, the constant hum of the generator just outside. Alara gave him nothing. She simply began to unpack her laptop, her movements economical and precise. Defeated by her lack of reaction, he retreated. For the first 48 hours, Alara became part of the base's drab scenery. She spoke only when necessary, her responses brief and to the point. She attended the mandatory briefings, sitting in the back, observing. Her official title was Senior Strategic Analyst, a deliberately vague designation for her role, to assess the base's operational readiness and write a report. It was a bureaucratic assignment, a cooling-off period after her last engagement. The details of that were buried under so many layers of black ink, they practically ceased to exist. To the soldiers of FOB Black Ridge, she was a ghost at the feast, a civilian in a world of uniforms. They saw a woman of average height, with dark hair pulled back in a severe, functional bun. Her face was lean, her eyes a deep, unreadable shade of gray. But they missed the finer details. They didn't see the faint, silvery scar that traced the line of her left eyebrow, or the dense, corded muscle in her forearms, visible only when she rolled up her sleeves to wash her hands. They didn't notice the calluses on her trigger finger, old and worn smooth, inconsistent with a lifetime spent behind a keyboard. Most of all, they didn't understand her stillness. In the clamor of the chow hall, amidst the clatter of trays and the boisterous laughter of young men and women letting off steam, Alara would sit alone, eating her meal with a slow, deliberate pace. Her eyes were never idle. She tracked the flow of traffic, noted the positions of the guards, clocked the response time when a corporal dropped a tray with a loud crash. She wasn't paranoid. She was processing. It was as natural to her as breathing. On her third day, she walked the perimeter. The guards in the towers watched her, a solitary figure making a slow circuit of the wire. She wasn't jogging for exercise. Her pace was methodical. She stopped at each corner of the base, her gaze fixed on the surrounding terrain. She was studying the lines of sight, the natural funnels, the dead ground where an enemy could approach unseen. She was memorizing the wind patterns, watching how the dust devils danced in the valley below, how the hardy, low-lying shrubs bent and swayed. To the guards, she was just a bored civilian killing time. To Alara, it was an orientation. She was learning the language of this new place, and its dialect was written in wind and rock. This place had teeth, and she made a point to know every single one. The quiet mockery of being ignored was a cloak she wore comfortably. It allowed her to see, truly see, without being seen herself. It was a tactical advantage she had no intention of surrendering. Hashtag part 2, the dismissal. The summons came via a crisp, young private who knocked on her office door with military precision. "Mom, Colonel Thorne requests your presence in his office. 0900 inch. I'll be there," Alara replied without looking up from the topographical maps spread across her desk. The private hesitated, then vanished. Alara continued to trace the contour lines with her finger, her mind already calculating engagement distances and potential observation posts. The colonel could wait. The mountain couldn't. Colonel Marcus Thorne's office was the largest container on the base, and he had made every effort to make it feel like a genuine command center. Framed photographs of him shaking hands with generals hung on the walls. A polished wooden plaque with his unit's crest sat on his immaculate desk. The air smelled faintly of lemon polish and authority. When Alara entered, he didn't rise. He gestured vaguely to the hard-backed chair opposite his desk, his eyes remaining fixed on a report he was signing. It was a classic power play, meant to establish dominance from the first second. Alara had seen it 100 times before. She sat, her back straight, her hands resting calmly in her lap. She didn't fidget. She didn't look around the room. She simply waited, a portrait of patient neutrality. Her stillness seemed to irritate him more than any protest would have. Finally, he capped his pen with a loud snap and leaned back, steepling his fingers. He was a man in his late 40s, with a square jaw, close-cropped gray hair, and the perpetually weary eyes of a career officer who felt the world was consistently failing to meet his standards. "Ms. Vance," he began, his voice a low baritone that carried an automatic expectation of deference. "Welcome to Black Ridge. I've read your file, or what little of it they saw fit to send me." He paused, letting the implication hang in the air. "Senior Strategic Analyst. A very impressive title. Tell me, what strategy does a civilian consultant believe she can offer my soldiers that they haven't already learned through years of experience in the field?" The question was a trap, designed to make her either boast or shrink. Alara did neither. "My job is to observe, analyze, and report on operational efficiency, Colonel. I'm here to provide an external perspective on your training protocols and resource allocation." Her answer was textbook, delivered without a trace of emotion. It was the perfect bureaucratic shield. Thorne's lip curled slightly. He had been hoping for a fight, or at least some sign of weakness. "An external perspective," he repeated, his tone dripping with condescension. "From Washington, I presume. Some think tank that believes warfare can be boiled down to a series of algorithms and flowcharts." He leaned forward, his voice dropping. "Let me be clear, Ms. Vance. This is not a laboratory. This is a forge. We train soldiers to fight and win in the most unforgiving environments on the planet. We deal in mud and blood and sweat, not data points. My men and women know what they're doing. They don't need a civilian looking over their shoulder, judging them from a clipboard." Alara's expression didn't change, but her mind was cataloging him. The slight tremor in his right hand when he gestured, too much caffeine or underlying stress. The way his eyes darted to the commendations on his wall, a need for external validation. The worn spot on the carpet under his desk where he tapped his foot. Impatience, a man who preferred action to deliberation. He wasn't a bad commander, she surmised, just a rigid one, threatened by anything that fell outside the clean lines of the chain of command. "I understand your position, Colonel," she said, her voice still infuriatingly calm. "My report is for command, not for public review. My intention is to remain as unobtrusive as possible. See that you do, Thorne said sharply, his patience clearly exhausted. You have your access, you have your quarters. Stay out of the operational areas unless explicitly invited. And for God's sake, stay off the firing ranges. It's a dangerous place for the uninitiated. We don't have time to play tour guide. It was a direct order and a blatant dismissal. He was putting her in a box labeled irrelevant and sealing the lid. He was making it clear that on his mountain, she was a guest, and an unwelcome one at that. Alara stood. Understood, Colonel. She didn't offer a thank you for your time. She didn't salute. She simply gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod and turned to leave. As her hand touched the doorknob, Thorne spoke again, a final, patronizing shot. "And Vance," he said, not bothering to look at her. "Try not to get in the way of the real soldiers. Their work is important." Alara paused for a fraction of a second, her back still to him. Her internal reaction was a cold, quiet wave of something ancient and familiar. It wasn't anger. It was focus. Men like Thorne were predictable. They were obstacles to be navigated, not enemies to be fought. His underestimation of her was not an insult. It was a tool, and she was more than happy to let him hand it to her. She opened the door and walked out into the biting wind, the colonel's dismissive words echoing in the sterile silence of his office. He had drawn his line in the sand. He had no idea she had spent a lifetime erasing them. #### part 3, the observation. True to her word, Alara became a phantom. She kept to her small office during the day, her laptop humming, her desk covered in printouts of meteorological data, ammunition ballistics charts, and satellite imagery of the surrounding mountain ranges. She requested access to the base's training schedules and after-action reports, and the clerks, acting on Thorne's implicit instructions, gave her the bare minimum. They saw her as a nuisance, a bureaucratic hurdle. They didn't see that she was building a complete operational picture of the FOB in her mind, piece by painstaking piece. She mapped the rhythms of the base. The pre-dawn rumble of engines as convoys prepared for patrol exercises. The midday shift changes at the guard towers. The exhausted quiet that fell after evening chow. She learned the faces of the soldiers, their ranks, their roles. She learned who was the unit's clown, who was the quiet professional, who was the braggart covering for insecurity. Her favorite place to observe, despite the colonel's warning, was the primary firing range. It was nestled in a long, narrow canyon a half-mile from the main compound, a location that amplified the sound of every shot into a rolling thunder. She never went onto the firing line. Instead, she would find a position on the rocky ridge that overlooked the canyon, partially concealed by a cluster of weather-beaten pines. From there, she had a perfect vantage point. She would sit for hours, a pair of compact, high-powered binoculars to her eyes, seemingly mesmerized by the repetitive process of shooting. But she wasn't just watching. She was dissecting. Her first visit coincided with a squad of young infantrymen practicing their marksmanship. They were led by a loud, barrel-chested staff sergeant named Riggs, a man who coached through a mixture of encouragement and ridicule. Alara watched him demonstrate the proper prone firing position. His form was good, textbook even. But as he instructed his soldiers, Alara saw the subtle flaws that repetition had ingrained in them. She watched a young private named Davis, his knuckles white as he gripped his M4 rifle. He was anticipating the recoil, flinching a microscopic moment before the hammer fell. His shots were consistently pulling low and to the right. Riggs yelled at him to control his breathing, but that wasn't the core problem. The kid was afraid of his own weapon. She saw another, a specialist named Chun, who was fast on the trigger but sloppy with his sight picture. He was chasing speed, trying to impress his peers, but his shot groupings were wide and inconsistent. He wasn't breathing between shots. He was holding his breath, starving his muscles, and his eyes, of oxygen, introducing a subtle tremor he couldn't even feel. Alara lowered her binoculars, her mind running the diagnostics. Davis needs dry fire practice, trigger pull exercises with a coin balanced on the barrel to build confidence and muscle memory. Chun needs to slow down. The mantra, slow is smooth, smooth is fast, isn't just a saying. It's a neurological reality. He needs to relearn the fundamentals of breath, squeeze, follow through. A few days later, a sniper team was on the range, working on long-distance targets set up at 800, 1,000, and 1,200 meters. The wind was particularly vicious that day, gusting unpredictably through the canyon. The shooter, a young but talented corporal, was struggling. His spotter was feeding him wind calls, but they were chasing the conditions, always a second behind. From her perch, Ilera wasn't watching the men. She was watching the environment. She saw things the spotter, lying prone just inches from the ground, was missing. She saw the way the heat haze shimmered differently over a patch of dark rock, indicating an updraft. She saw the subtle sway of the distant pines at the 1,000-meter mark moving in the opposite direction of the grass, just in front of the firing line. There were at least two, possibly three, distinct wind channels between the rifle and the target. The spotter was only reading the first one. He's calling for a 15 hold off, she thought. Her eyes narrowed in concentration. But the inversion layer near the target is pushing it back at least 0.3 mils. He needs to be holding 12, maybe 11 on the lulls. The rifle cracked, and a puff of dust erupted from the dirt berm a full meter to the left of the steel target. The shooter swore in frustration. The spotter cursed the wind. This was Ilera's routine. She would watch, analyze, and diagnose, all from a distance. The soldiers on the range became aware of the silent figure on the ridge. At first, they were curious. Soon, the curiosity curdled into a kind of low-grade mockery. "Look, the consultant is back," Riggs would say, loud enough for his squad to hear. "Probably taking notes on our trigger finger ergonomics for her big report," his men would chuckle. They started calling her the vulture, watching from on high, or clipboard, the faceless bureaucrat. The jokes were never to her face, always whispered behind hands or muttered just as she walked by. They were small acts of exclusion, meant to reinforce that she was an outsider, that she didn't belong in their world of cordite and steel. Ilera heard the whispers. She knew the nicknames. It didn't bother her. Their mockery was born of ignorance, and ignorance was a condition that could, under the right circumstances, be cured. She remained on her ridge, her binoculars steady, her mind sharp. She was a master of a deadly and precise art, and these soldiers were, whether they knew it or not, putting on a clinic of common mistakes. She filed it all away. Every flinched trigger pull, every misread wind, every rush shot. It was all just data, and sooner or later, data always found a practical application. #### part 4. The pressure. The pressure began to build with the arrival of the helicopters. Two sleek, black MH-60s, unmarked and menacing, descended on FOB Black Ridge with a percussive roar that rattled the windows of every container building. They didn't land at the main helipad. They settled in a cordoned-off section of the tarmac, disgorging a team of 8 men who moved with a fluid, predatory grace that was utterly distinct from the structured discipline of the Army soldiers. They were Navy SEALs, a team from DevGru on a high-altitude familiarization exercise. Their presence instantly changed the atmosphere of the base. The regular soldiers watched them with a mixture of awe and intimidation. The SEALs were quiet, professional, and radiated an aura of lethal competence. Colonel Thorne, desperate to have his base and his men appear equally competent, scheduled a joint long-range marksmanship demonstration. It was meant to be a showcase of his unit's best talent. The chosen day dawned with a clear, blue sky, but the wind, Black Ridge's cruelest resident, was awake and angry. It howled down from the peaks, a raw, physical force that tore at flags and kicked up stinging clouds of dust. On the long-range portion of the canyon, it created a chaotic vortex of competing currents. The demonstration was a disaster. Thorne had selected his best sniper team, the same corporal and his spotter that Ilera had observed days before. In front of the assembled SEALs and the colonel himself, they failed, miserably. The targets, steel silhouettes placed at intervals from 1,000 to 1,500 meters, remained untouched. Each crack of the rifle was followed by the frustrating thump of a round impacting the dirt berm, sometimes meters off target. The wind was a puzzle they simply could not solve. The corporal, his face flushed with shame, grew more and more frustrated with each miss. His movements became jerky, his trigger pulls rushed. The spotter's voice, calling out wind adjustments, grew tight with panic. Hold 2.5 mils left. No, wait, it's shifting. Hold 3. Another shot, another miss. The clang of striking steel, the sound of success, was absent. The only sound was the wind, mocking them. Colonel Thorne stood behind the firing line, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, his jaw set like granite. His face was a thundercloud of controlled fury. His showcase was turning into an exhibition of incompetence, and it was happening in front of the Navy's elite. The SEALs stood off to one side, their expressions unreadable behind their wraparound sunglasses. They weren't sneering or laughing. They were simply observing, their silence a far more damning judgment than any insult. Alara was in her usual spot on the ridge overlooking the range. She hadn't been invited, of course. She had simply come, drawn by the activity. Through her binoculars, the scene played out like a slow-motion catastrophe. She wasn't watching the shooters anymore. Her entire focus was on the full length of the canyon. She watched the vapor trail of each missed shot, a ghostly gray line that bent and twisted in the air, telling the story of the bullet's journey through the treacherous currents. She could read the wind like a book. A powerful downdraft was coming off the cliff face to the right, colliding with a crosswind funneling up the canyon floor. The result was a turbulent, unpredictable spiral about 800 meters out. The spotter was reading the wind at the firing line and guessing the rest. He was trying to solve a three-dimensional physics problem with one-dimensional data. The pressure on the firing line was becoming unbearable. The young corporal finally put his rifle down, his confidence shattered. "Sir, I can't read it. It's everywhere at once." Thorne's face darkened. He was about to call off the demonstration, to admit defeat. It was a humiliation he would not soon forget. The soldiers who had once mocked Alara, including Sergeant Riggs and his squad who were there to observe, were now staring at the ground, sharing in their commander's shame. The entire base seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for the failure to be made official. The lead SEAL, a chief petty officer with the name Kalani on his uniform, stepped forward. He was built like a swimmer, lean and powerful, with a calm demeanor that seemed unaffected by the wind or the tension. He walked over to his own gear and unzipped a long rifle bag, revealing a work of art. It was a heavily customized MK-13 Mod 7, a 300 Winchester Magnum sniper rifle, its chassis a sleek, skeletal frame of machined aluminum, its Schmidt and Bender scope the size of a small telescope. He conferred quietly with his own spotter, then lay down and took a few shots himself. Even he, one of the world's elite snipers, was having trouble. He hit the 1,000-meter target, but missed the 1,200. He got up, shaking his head slightly, a look of professional frustration on his face. It was then that his gaze drifted up, scanning the terrain as if searching for an answer. His eyes, sharp and accustomed to picking out the smallest details, swept past the cluster of pines on the ridge. He paused. He squinted. He saw a figure, perfectly still, not looking at the shooters but out at the canyon itself. It was Alara. There was something in her posture, an absolute and unwavering stillness, that cut through the chaos of the wind. It was the stillness of a predator, not a spectator. The crisis on the range had reached its peak, the soldiers were panicked, and the colonel was defeated. But on the ridge, the woman they called Clipboard was utterly, unervingly calm. Part 5. The Intervention. Chief Petty Officer Kai Kalani was a man who trusted his gut. His gut had kept him alive on every continent, in situations that would have destroyed lesser men. And right now, his gut was telling him that the motionless figure on the ridge was the most interesting thing in this entire chaotic canyon. He spoke a few words to his men, then started walking, not toward the firing line, but toward the ridge. The move was so unexpected that it drew everyone's attention. Colonel Thorne watched, confused and annoyed by this new breach of protocol. The soldiers looked on, wondering what the SEAL was doing. Kai climbed the rocky slope with an easy, athletic gait. The wind whipped at his uniform, but he moved through it as if it were a minor inconvenience. He stopped about 10 feet from Alara, not wanting to crowd her. She didn't turn, didn't acknowledge him. Alara slowly lowered her binoculars. She turned her head, and for the first time, Kai saw her eyes up close. They were the color of a winter storm, and they held an unnerving depth of focus. There was no fear in them, no surprise, only assessment. "The spotter is reading the wind at his position," she said, her voice even, devoid of any I-told-you-so smugness. "He's not accounting for the vertical shear off the south face or the Venturi effect halfway down the canyon. The bullet is hitting a compression zone at 700 meters, then a dead spot, then a hard right-to-left push just before the target," she pointed with her chin. "You can see in the way the tall grass is bending near that rock slide. It's moving opposite the dust at our feet." Kai listened, his expression unchanging, but his mind was racing. Her analysis was instantaneous, precise, and more detailed than anything his own team had discussed. She spoke the language of long-range ballistics like it was her native tongue. Vertical shear, Venturi effect, compression zone. This was not the vocabulary of a senior strategic analyst. He had seen enough. He made a decision that was part intuition, part desperation, and part a deep, professional curiosity to see what would happen next. "Come with me," he said. He turned and started back down the slope. After a moment's hesitation, Alara followed. As they approached the firing line, a hush fell over the assembled soldiers. They stared, dumbfounded, as the SEAL team leader walked back into their midst with a civilian consultant, the vulture trailing in his wake. Colonel Thorne took a step forward, his face a mask of indignation. "Chief, what is the meaning of this? This is a live-fire exercise." Kai held up a hand, a simple gesture that nonetheless carried immense authority. "Colonel, with all due respect, please wait." He didn't wait for a reply. He walked to his rifle, the magnificent MK-13, and picked it up. He turned not to his own men, not to the army sniper, but to Alara. The crowd of soldiers, from Thorne down to the lowest private, watched in stunned silence. He held the rifle out to her. "Show them," he said. The air crackled with tension. Sergeant Riggs's jaw was literally hanging open. Private Davis looked as though he'd seen an apparition. Colonel Thorne looked like he was about to have an aneurysm. He started to bellow. "Absolutely not. This is a gross." Kai cut him off with a look. It was a cold, flat, utterly uncompromising stare that said, "This is happening." Thorne, a man used to absolute command, found himself silenced by the sheer, undeniable force of the SEAL's will. Alara looked at the rifle, then at Kai's face. She saw no mockery there, only a raw, professional challenge. She gave a single, curt nod. She took the weapon. The moment her hands closed around the rifle's chassis, something changed. The quiet, unobtrusive analyst vanished. In her place stood someone else entirely. Her movements became a symphony of fluid efficiency. She didn't immediately drop into a firing position. First, she checked the rifle. Her fingers flew over the weapon, an intimate, familiar dance. She checked the seating of the magazine. She tested the tension on the bipod legs. She put her eye to the Schmidt and Bender scope, her right hand finding the parallax knob by instinct, adjusting it with a surgeon's touch until the reticle was perfectly sharp against the distant target. She dry fire at once, testing the feel of the custom trigger, which probably had a pull weight of less than 2 pounds. Satisfied, she moved to the firing mat. She didn't just lie down. She flowed into a prone position, her body low to the ground, her elbows forming a solid base, her spine perfectly aligned with the barrel of the rifle. It was a position of such practiced perfection that it made the Army sniper's textbook form look clumsy and amateurish. She settled in, the butt of the rifle nestled into the pocket of her shoulder. She took a slow, deep breath and let half of it out, entering the state of calm focus known to shooters as the natural respiratory pause. The world outside the circular view of her scope ceased to exist. There was only the reticle, the wind, and the 1,200-meter target. She didn't fire. She waited. 1 second. 5. 10. She was watching the mirage, the heat shimmer rising from the ground, reading the subtle shifts in the wind that were invisible to everyone else. The entire range was silent, save for the wind itself. Then, in a moment of relative calm between two powerful gusts, her finger tightened on the trigger. There was no jerk, no flinch. The rifle boomed, a deep, powerful crack that was sharper than the M24 the Army sniper had been using. The rifle pushed back in her shoulder, but her body absorbed the recoil flawlessly. The reticle barely moved off target. For 3 long seconds, the only sound was the wind. Then, faint but clear, a sound echoed back down the canyon. Ping! The unmistakable sound of a .300 Winchester Magnum round striking a 1-meter steel plate at a distance of over a kilometer. A perfect center hit. A collective gasp went through the crowd of soldiers. Alara didn't react. Her hand moved with swift, economical grace to the bolt, ejecting the spent casing and chambering a new round. I never left the scope. She shifted her aim to the 1,500-meter target, the one nobody had even attempted to hit. Again, she waited, her breathing controlled, her body a statue of perfect form. She made a minute adjustment to her windage knob. She waited for the lull. The rifle boomed again. The wait was longer this time, the bullet taking nearly 2 seconds to cross the distance. The soldiers held their breath. Ping! Another perfect hit. A ripple of disbelief washed over the onlookers. This wasn't just good shooting. This was impossible shooting. This wasn't luck. It was a demonstration of absolute mastery over weapon, environment, and self. #### part 6, the shift. In the ringing silence that followed the second shot, Alara cycled the bolt one more time, placed the rifle on safe, and folded the bipod legs. She rose from the mat with the same fluid grace she had displayed getting into position. The entire sequence, from taking the rifle to hitting 2 near-impossible shots, had taken less than 2 minutes. She walked back to Kai and handed him his rifle, holding it with the professional respect due to a precision instrument. "Good balance on the weapon," she said, her voice as calm and even as if she were commenting on the weather. "The trigger has a clean break. 0 creep." Kai took the rifle, his eyes locked on her face. He was a man who had seen the best shooters in the world, had trained with them, and had fought beside them. What he had just witnessed was on another level entirely. It wasn't just the mechanics of the shots. It was the preternatural calm, the absolute certainty of her actions. It was the way she had become one with the rifle and the environment. "Keep it," he said, his voice low and serious. "For the rest of the exercise, you're shooting with us." It wasn't a request. It was a statement of induction. In that single moment, she had gone from being an outsider to being an asset in his eyes. Alara simply nodded. Okay. The shift on the range was palpable. The atmosphere of mockery had evaporated, replaced by a thick cloud of stunned awe and confusion. Sergeant Riggs, who had been the most vocal of her detractors, was now staring at her, his mouth slightly agape, his face pale. He looked like a man who had just watched his house cat transform into a tiger. Private Davis and Specialist Chun were exchanging wide-eyed, speechless glances. They had mocked this woman, called her clipboard, and she had just performed a feat of marksmanship that their most decorated instructors could only dream of. The shame was a physical weight pressing down on them. Colonel Thorne was the most affected. He stood frozen, his face a complex battlefield of emotions. Shock, disbelief, and a dawning, terrifying suspicion. The neat, orderly world he commanded had just been turned upside down. The woman he had dismissed as an irrelevant paper pusher, the analyst he had personally ordered to stay away from the range, had just outshot a Navy SEAL with his own rifle in conditions that had grounded his best men. His authority felt suddenly fragile. Who was she? What was a person with that level of skill doing on his base under a civilian cover, writing reports on operational efficiency? The question echoed in the silent chambers of his mind, and he had no answer. The whispers started almost immediately, spreading from the range back to the main compound like a shockwave. The story grew with each telling. Some said she hit the target with her eyes closed. Others swore the bullet had curved around a rock. The facts were dramatic enough, but the legend was already beginning to form. Alara, for her part, seemed oblivious to the seismic shift she had caused. After her brief exchange with Kai, she walked over to the SEAL team's observation post. Kai's spotter, a younger SEAL whose helmet simply read Axe, immediately made room for her, handing her his spotting scope and data book without a word. He looked at her with the unfiltered reverence a student gives a grandmaster. Alara took the scope and settled in. Her focus already shifted to the next task. "Let's work on the moving targets," she said to Kai, her tone all business. "The wind is going to be a factor on the lead." For the rest of the afternoon, she acted as the primary spotter and alternate shooter for the SEAL team. Her wind calls were flawless. Her corrections were precise. She and Kai fell into an easy, professional rhythm, communicating with the clipped, abbreviated language of two experts who understand each other perfectly. Target 3, moving left to right, 8 kilometers per hour. Give him a 1.1 mil lead. Wait for the gust. Send it. Ping. The soldiers of FOB Black Ridge watched from a distance, no longer participants but spectators at a masterclass. They saw their colonel, Marcus Thorne, standing alone, his arms crossed, his gaze fixed on the woman he had so thoroughly underestimated. He was no longer angry. He was deeply, profoundly unsettled. The comfortable certainties of his command had been shattered by 2 bullets in a high wind, and his world was suddenly full of questions he was afraid to ask. The balance of power on the mountain had shifted, not by a command or a rank, but by a simple, undeniable demonstration of skill. #### Part 7, the second test. The true test didn't come on the controlled environment of the firing range. It arrived 24 hours later, delivered by the encrypted squawk of a satellite phone in the Tactical Operations Center, TOC. The TOC was the nerve center of the base, a dark, climate-controlled container filled with glowing screens, maps, and the low hum of electronics. It was a room that smelled of stale coffee and adrenaline. An urgent intelligence update had come down from High Command. A high-value target, HVT, a regional insurgent leader responsible for a string of deadly attacks, had been located. For months, he had been a ghost, moving between remote mountain villages, never staying in one place for more than a few hours. Now, satellite and drone surveillance had pinned him down. He was scheduled to attend a meeting in a fortified compound in a valley just 60 miles from FOB Black Ridge, across a hostile border. The problem was the window of opportunity. The HVT would be exposed for less than 30 minutes, outdoors, in the compound's courtyard. A drone strike was ruled out due to the risk of collateral damage. The compound was adjacent to a small civilian settlement. A direct assault was impossible to stage in time. The only viable option was a long-range sniper Overwatch mission. A collective groan went through the TOC as the topographical map was displayed on the main screen. The target compound was nestled deep in a valley, surrounded by sheer cliffs on 3 sides. There was only one potential observation post with a clear line of sight, a rocky promontory designated Observation Point Omega. "What's the range from Omega to the target?" Colonel Thorne demanded. The intelligence officer, a young captain, swallowed hard. "Sir, the horizontal distance is 2,415 meters. A heavy silence fell over the room. Over 24 kilometers. Nearly a mile and a half. It was a shot that bordered on the impossible at the absolute extreme edge of what was ballistically feasible, even for the most advanced sniper systems in the world. And the environmental factors? Thorne pressed, his voice tight. "Worse, sir," the captain replied, pulling up the meteorological data. The forecast for the engagement window shows high velocity, unpredictable crosswinds in the valley, with a projected temperature drop of 15 degrees. The altitude difference between OP Omega and the target is over 1,000 feet, which will significantly affect the bullet's trajectory. air density, Coriolis effect. Every factor is working against us. Thorne paced in front of the screens, his hands clasped behind his back. It was a golden opportunity, the kind of intelligence that could change the course of the regional conflict. But the risks were astronomical. A missed shot would not only alert the HVT that he was being watched, but it would also give away the position of the sniper team, leaving them exposed deep in enemy territory. "It's too risky," he said finally, his voice heavy with resignation. "The probability of success is too low. I'm not sending a team on a suicide mission. Inform command, we are scrubbing the op." "Sir." It was Kai Kalani's voice. He and his SEAL team had been in the briefing, standing silently in the back of the room. He stepped forward now, his face grim. "Sir, we can make it. We can get a team to OP Omega before the window closes." "That's not the issue, Chief," Thorne snapped, his frustration boiling over. "Getting there is one thing. Making a shot under those conditions is another. It's a 1 in a million chance. I want to prove it." Cut him back down. His gaze was steady. "The probability might be low, but it's not zero." His eyes then flickered across the room, past the colonel, past the screens, and settled on a figure standing quietly by the doorway. Alara. She had been brought into the TOC to provide analysis on the logistical data for the region, her official, mundane duty. She had been listening to the entire exchange, her expression unreadable. "Sir," Kai said, his voice dropping slightly but losing none of its intensity. "There might be a way." He looked directly at Alara. "We have an asset on this base who might be able to change the probability." Every head in the room turned to follow his gaze. The soldiers and officers stared at the quiet civilian analyst. A day ago, they would have dismissed the idea as absurd. Now, after the stories from the range, a current of curiosity and anticipation ran through the room. Thorne followed Kai's look, his eyes narrowing. He was a man backed into a corner. His superiors wanted the HVT. His tactical assessment screamed no-go. But the SEAL, an operator from the most respected unit in the military, was suggesting this unassuming woman held the key. It was a colossal gamble, a leap of faith that went against every regulation in the book. He made his decision. "Ms. Vance," he said, his voice booming in the tense quiet of the TOC. He put her on the spot, in front of everyone. This was her second test, far more consequential than the first. "You've heard the data. You've seen the maps. You're the strategic analyst. So analyze. Is a shot from observation point Omega possible?" Alara stepped forward, away from the shadows of the doorway. She walked to the central console, her eyes scanning the complex web of data on the screens. She didn't look at the range. She looked at the component parts, the barometric pressure, the humidity, the spin drift calculations for a 338 Lapua Magnum round at that specific altitude, the topographical schematics that would influence the wind. She was silent for a full minute, absorbing it all. The entire TOC held its breath. Finally, she spoke, her voice calm and clinical, as if she were solving a complex mathematical equation. "The shot is not impossible," she stated. "The primary challenge is not the distance, but the transonic destabilization of the bullet. The round will drop below the speed of sound approximately 200 meters from the target, creating a significant and unpredictable wobble. This can be mitigated by using a heavier, high BC round, like a 300-grain Sierra Match King." She pointed to the meteorological display. "The wind is the main variable, but the valley's geography creates predictable compression zones. A spotter with the right equipment and knowledge could walk the shooter onto the target. It would require perfect communication and absolute trust between shooter and spotter." She paused, then looked directly at Colonel Thorne. "It's a low-probability engagement, Colonel," she concluded, "but it is not a zero-probability one." Thorne stared at her, his mind reeling from the technical precision of her analysis. She hadn't given an opinion. She had presented a solution. The desperation of the situation, combined with the undeniable evidence of her expertise, forced his hand. "All right," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of the decision. "I'm authorizing the mission." He looked at Kai. "Chief, you're the shooter." Then he turned his gaze back to Alara, his expression one of grim resolution. And Ms. Vance, you're the spotter. You made the call. Now back it up. Hashtag part 8. The reveal. The mission was a whisper. Two black helicopters flying nap of the earth, their rotors beating a muffled rhythm against the cold night air. They inserted the four-man team, Kai, Alara, and two other SEALs for security, 5 miles from Opie Omega, then vanished back into the darkness. The world shrank to the green, ghostly images seen through night vision goggles and the sound of their own breathing. The infiltration was arduous, a grueling climb through treacherous, rock-strewn terrain in the thin, oxygen-starved air. Alara moved with the same tireless, efficient gait as the SEALs, her pack riding easy on her shoulders, her breathing controlled. She carried her own gear, a high-powered spotting scope, a laser rangefinder, a Kestrel weather meter, and a ruggedized laptop loaded with advanced ballistic software. She was no longer an analyst. She was an operator, and she moved as if she had been born to this world of shadows and risk. Kai watched her, impressed. There was no complaint, no hesitation. Their communication was a clipped shorthand, the language of professionals who don't need to waste words. "Watch your footing. Loose shale at 10 o'clock, he'd murmur into his radio. "Seen," she'd reply. They reached observation point Omega 2 hours before sunrise, a miserable sliver of rock overlooking the vast, dark valley. The wind was a physical beast, trying to tear them from the mountain. They set up their position in the pre-dawn chill, building a small hideout of rocks and a camouflage tarp. As the sun began to light the eastern sky, the target compound slowly emerged from the gloom below. Through the powerful optics of her spotting scope, Alara could see individual guards patrolling the walls. It was exactly as the intel had described. The rangefinder confirmed the distance, 2,421 meters. Kai was already in position, his 338 Lapua rifle resting solidly on its bipod, a long, menacing tube of steel and carbon fiber. He was a picture of calm, his breathing slow and steady. He trusted his equipment. He trusted his training. Now, he had to put his absolute trust in the woman lying beside him. "Wind is gusting from 9 o'clock at 20 miles per hour, Alara reported, her eye pressed to her scope. "But there's a downdraft closer to the target. I'm seeing a reversal. Stand by for a full calculation." For the next several hours, they waited. The tension was a living thing, a cold knot in the gut. They spoke only to update data. Alara fed a constant stream of information into her laptop, building a complex, multivariable firing solution. She wasn't just reading the wind. She was predicting it, analyzing the patterns, the lulls, the gusts, creating a dynamic map of the air between them and the target. The sun climbed higher. The 30-minute engagement window opened. The courtyard below remained empty. Minutes ticked by, each one an eternity. The two security SEALs scanned the surrounding ridges, their rifles at the ready. 10 minutes left in the window, Kai said, his voice a low rumble. "I see movement," Alara whispered, her body tensing. "Target is coming into the courtyard. Positive ID." Through the scope, the HVT was a tiny figure surrounded by his lieutenants. He was laughing, confident in the security of his mountain fortress. "Range is 2,420 meters. No change," Alara said, her voice steady, belying the immense pressure. "The wind is holding steady for the moment. My solution is an elevation of 384 mils up. Windage is 39 mils left." Kai dialed the enormous adjustments into his scope, the turrets clicking with precision. "Dialed. Ready. Hold," Alara commanded. She saw a subtle shift in the heat mirage rising from the valley floor. "Wind is picking up. Adjusting. Hold 41 mils left. Adjusted. Wait for the lull," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "It's a 10-second cycle. Fire on my mark. Stand by. Mark." Kai's whole world had shrunk to the crosshairs of his scope. He didn't think. He didn't hesitate. He exhaled, and on Alara's command, he squeezed the trigger. The rifle erupted with a massive boom, kicking a cloud of dust up from the muzzle brake. The recoil slammed into Kai's shoulder. It took over 3.5 seconds for the 300-grain bullet to cross the valley. 3.5 seconds of agonizing, suspended time. Alara never took her eye from the spotting scope, watching the vapor trail of the bullet as it flew, a faint, corkscrewing line in the air. Trace looks good. Down in the courtyard, the HVE suddenly collapsed, his meeting ending in a silent, distant puff of red. Chaos erupted as his guards scrambled for cover, firing blindly into the surrounding hills. Target down, Alara said, her voice completely flat. Direct hit. Good shot, cock. Good call, spotter, he replied, his own voice tight with the release of tension. Let's go home. They packed their gear in a flurry of controlled speed and melted back into the mountains. Back at FOB Black Ridge, the TOC was electric. Confirmation of a successful mission had come through. The impossible shot had been made. Colonel Thorne stood before the main screen, a secure video link open to his commanding officer, a 3-star general at CENTCOM. Outstanding work, Marcus, the general's voice crackled through the speakers. My sources are confirming the HVT is down. That was a 1 in a million shot. I want to know who was on that scope. Who was the spotter who made that win call? Thorne hesitated for a fraction of a second. Sir, the primary spotter was a civilian analyst assigned to my FOB. Alara Vance. The line went silent for a long moment. Thorne could hear the faint sound of shuffling papers. Vance, the general repeated, his voice suddenly sharp, edged with disbelief. Did you say Alara Vance? Yes, sir, Thorne confirmed, confused by the reaction. Give me her file, the general commanded, his voice now a steel whip. The real one. Top-level clearance. Now, an hour later, a single, heavily encrypted file appeared on Colonel Thorne's secure terminal. He opened it. Most of the document was a sea of solid black blocks, entire paragraphs, and pages redacted into oblivion. But a few lines were visible. Name, Vance Alara M. Last assignment. Classified, Joint Special Operations Command. Specialty, long-range interdiction/special reconnaissance. Status, inactive/administrative leave pending review. And then, at the bottom of the page, a single, chilling entry under the heading Operational Designator : Call sign, Wraith. Thorne stared at the word. Wraith. He'd heard the name before, spoken in hushed, reverent tones in intelligence circles. A ghost. A legend. A Tier 1 operator, a sniper credited with some of the most difficult and politically sensitive eliminations of the last decade. An operative who had reportedly gone rogue on her last mission, resulting in her being disappeared into the bureaucratic system. He had been hosting a legend, and he had dismissed her as a paper pusher. The mockery, the condescension, his petty displays of authority, it all came rushing back to him, tinged with a profound, gut-wrenching shame. He finally had his answer, and it terrified him. Part 9, the respect. The morning after the mission, the wind at Black Ridge was unusually calm. It was as if the mountain itself was holding its breath. The news of the successful operation had swept through the base, but the official story was sanitized. A Joint Special Operations Task Force had neutralized the target. No mention was made of the true nature of the shot, or who had been involved. But on a small base, secrets have a short shelf life. Whispers followed Kai and his team, and by extension, they followed the woman who had gone into the mountains with them and returned. The atmosphere had undergone a final, profound transformation. The awe from the range demonstration had deepened into something else, something closer to reverence, tinged with a healthy dose of fear. The soldiers who had once called her vulture and clipboard now averted their eyes when she passed. They would flatten themselves against the walls of the narrow container hallways to let her by, offering mumbled ma'ams. The mockery was dead and buried. Alara's routine did not change. She woke at the same time. She went to her office. At midday, she walked to the chow hall. It was here that the final act of her silent campaign for respect would play out. As she entered the cavernous, noisy dining facility, the usual clatter of trays and loud conversations seemed to falter. A ripple of silence spread out from the door as people noticed her. It wasn't the silence of exclusion anymore. It was the silence of deference. She got her tray, her expression as impassive as ever, and found an empty table in the corner, just as she always did. The bubble of quiet followed her, a pocket of stillness in the crowded room. She sat down and began to eat, seemingly oblivious to the dozens of pairs of eyes now fixed on her. Then, the main doors opened again. Colonel Marcus Thorne strode in. The entire room fell completely silent. Every soldier, every officer, every contractor stopped what they were doing and watched. Thorne was not in his combat uniform. He wore his crisp dress service uniform, the one reserved for formal ceremonies. His ribbons and medals were perfectly aligned over his breast pocket. His stride was deliberate, his purpose clear. He didn't get a tray. He didn't look at anyone else. He walked a straight, unerring line through the maze of tables, his polished boots clicking on the concrete floor. His path ended at one place, Elara Vance's small, isolated table. She looked up from her meal as his shadow fell over her. She didn't look surprised or intimidated. She simply looked at him, her gray eyes meeting his. Colonel Thorne stood at attention before her. He did not speak. He did not offer an apology or an explanation. He knew that words would be inadequate, that they would only cheapen the moment. He had dismissed her, condescended to her, and belittled her in the name of his own rigid authority. He had been wrong, utterly, fundamentally wrong. He had judged the book by its cover, and the cover had read civilian analyst, while the pages within told the epic of a warrior. So he offered the only thing he could, a gesture of pure, undiluted, professional respect. He looked her directly in the eye, and he gave a slow, deliberate nod. It was a small movement, but in the silent, watching Chow Hall, it was as loud as a cannon shot. It was a public and undeniable acknowledgement of her skill, her status, her worth. It was his surrender. It was his salute. Then, just as deliberately, he turned and walked out of the Chow Hall, the doors swinging shut behind him. The spell was broken. A low murmur filled the room as everyone began to process what they had just witnessed. A moment later, another figure appeared at Alara's table. It was Kai Kalani, his tray in hand. He slid into the seat opposite her without asking. The other SEALs from his team followed, taking the remaining seats at the table, forming a protective, inclusive circle around her. They began to eat, creating a zone of comfortable normalcy around her. Kai looked at her, a small, genuine smile touching the corners of his mouth. "Heard you're extending your contract," he said casually, as if they were discussing the weather. It wasn't a question. He had already spoken to Thorne. Alara picked at her food for a moment before replying. "They need a new report on high-altitude operational efficiency." "Good," Kai said, his smile widening slightly. He knew the report was just a cover story. He was looking at his new spotter. She wasn't a civilian anymore. She wasn't a ghost from a redacted file. She was one of them. She belonged. And she had earned her place not with words, but with action. #### Part 10. The Closure. The sun was setting over the jagged peaks that cradled FOB Black Ridge, painting the sky in violent streaks of orange and purple. The wind, for once, was still. A profound, crystalline silence had settled over the high-altitude desert, broken only by the distant hum of the base generators. Alara stood alone on the ridge overlooking the firing range. It was the same spot where she had once been the subject of whispers and mockery, the invisible woman they called the Vulture. Now, the place felt different. It was hers. She wasn't holding binoculars or a rifle. Her hands were tucked into the pockets of her jacket, her posture relaxed. She was simply watching as the last light of day glinted off the distant steel targets, turning them into small, bright stars against the darkening earth. The 1,200-meter plate, the 1,500-meter plate. They were no longer just targets. They were markers, monuments to the moment everything changed. She thought of Thorne's nod in the Chow Hall. It was a more meaningful apology than 1,000 words could ever be. It was an acknowledgement from one world to another, a bridge built across the chasm of rank and regulation. He had not mentioned her file, had not breathed a word of the name Wraith. He had respected her past by leaving it in the shadows, choosing instead to honor the woman who stood before him now. It was a gesture of profound dignity, and she accepted it as such. She thought of Kai and his team, who now treated her as one of their own. They didn't ask about her history. In their world, you were what you could do, right here, right now. And she had shown them what she could do. The quiet camaraderie she felt sitting at their table was a feeling she thought she had lost forever, buried in the rubble of her last, disastrous mission. Her official title was still Senior Strategic Analyst. Her duties, on paper, were still bureaucratic and mundane. But the fiction no longer mattered. Her real purpose here was now an open secret, understood by all but spoken by none. She was the base's ghost, its hidden weapon, the quiet professional who saw things others missed. She was the final, unassailable standard against which all others would be measured. She was no longer hiding. A person can't hide when they are seen so clearly. The mockery had forced her hand, and in doing so, it had inadvertently liberated her. She had been living in a self-imposed exile, a gray limbo created by redacted files and administrative leave. Here, on this barren mountain, surrounded by soldiers who now looked at her with a respect bordering on awe, she had found a strange sort of peace. A lone figure started up the path toward a ridge. It was Private Davis, the young soldier she had watched flinch on the range. He walked hesitantly, as if approaching a sacred site. He stopped a respectful distance away, clutching his rifle. "Ma'am," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Sergeant Riggs sent me. He said, I need more dry-fire practice." To build confidence, he looked down at his boots, then back up at her, his eyes full of a desperate, youthful earnestness. "I was wondering if maybe you could show me how not to flinch." Alara looked at the young man, at the mix of fear and hope in his eyes. She saw a reflection of a younger version of herself, a recruit struggling to master the fundamentals. For years, her skills had been used for one purpose only, to end lives from a distance. Now, here was a chance to use that same knowledge to build something up, to impart a small piece of her hard-won wisdom. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips. It was the first genuine smile anyone at FOB Blackridge had ever seen from her. "All right, Private," she said, her voice soft in the twilight. "Let's see your stance." She didn't look out at the distant targets anymore. Her focus was on the soldier in front of her. The symbolic image was no longer of a solitary, silhouetted figure defined by her past. It was of a teacher, a mentor, grounded in the present. Her dignity was intact, her respect was earned, and her new purpose was just beginning. The silence on the mountain was no longer one of dismissal or tension. It was the quiet of a lesson about to begin.